So our agenda is that we will have the four speakers. Mr. Foster will be on Zoom. He couldn't make it from the vineyard today. But we will have 3 live speakers here. We have experts from across the country who will identify themselves. And I just want to give my own personal little introduction to this issue. It's something that has concerned me for a long time. I grew up here. I remember the trees, the pitch pines that were all burned along Rocky Pond Road when I would ride with my grandmother in the woods. But more recently, yesterday, I spent the afternoon with my friend Daniel, who's a member of the Wampanoag tribe, the Herring Pond tribe, and he has hunted fish and gathered on these lands of Myles Standish State Forest and the Southeastern Mass Pine Barrens Reserve his entire life, and his father before him, his grandfather before him. And he contacted me about 8 months ago, extremely upset that the woods where he had hunted in his entire life and was taking his son out now, he has 4 children, that the woods were being cut down and he didn't understand why. Vast areas. So now we have almost 2,000 acres of public land in Plymouth that have been clear cut. So he really couldn't understand it, and he was really upset.
Recording in progress.
Because we are being recorded. I hope that's okay. Because the Department of Conservation and Recreation, in the clear cut, most recently, had taken out his deer stand. So he trucked into the woods 2 miles with his bow to get some venison to feed his family, and the deer stand was gone. And it's just gone on and on from there. So yesterday, we toured around to some of these areas and we saw what's happening to our forests. And there's really no public participation or input or consideration of different points of view in our opinion. So that's why we're here, and without further ado, I want to give a voice to people who can't be here today, but who are very, very concerned about our forests, and hopefully we can come to a better understanding of what's going on. So thank you for coming, and I will pass the mic over to Mike Kellett, who is one of my good friends, founder of Restore the North Woods. He's probably one of the nation's experts on our national parks, how they were founded, what it takes to get a national park designated, and he can tell you more about his organization. And then we'll just move through our speakers, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So thank you so much.
Thanks for coming. I'm going to introduce George Worker. 40 years or so. He's an expert on forest ecology. He's been in wilderness areas around the country. He lived in Vermont for a number of years. He has a New England background as well, and he's written a bunch of books, including one on wildfire, which is published nationally. Also, we're going to have David Foster, who's on Zoom, who's Director Emeritus at Harvard Forest, and he's a forest ecologist, and he's done lots of work not in the field looking at forests and ecosystems and region. And then we have Bill Stubblefield, who's a PhD biologist from Harvard, who worked with E.O. Wilson when he was on faculty, and is a stalwart champion of nature and wildlife protected areas. So that's just a very quick, there's more information on the invitation, so it's in great detail, but if you want to add a little bit of something when you start, go ahead. So George, turn it over to George and take it away.
Okay. Let me begin with a little bit of background on myself. I went to college at the University of Montana in Missoula, and my botany professor was a bioecologist, so it didn't matter what class you took from him, whether it was introduction to biology or whatever else, we always got lots of stuff about fires. And that's sort of my first introduction to thinking somewhat differently about wildfires. It's not.
It's not the room.
There's always technical. Is this better?
Yeah. Yes, it is much better.
So anyway, and then, some pivotal
You gotta turn it on.
events.
But even just,
Some pivotal events.
okay.
And after that was, eventually I moved to Livingston, Montana, which is just north of Yellowstone Park. And I was there in 1988 when the large wildfires burned across Yellowstone. And that was a real eye-opener to me for reasons that may not be obvious immediately. But over the years, I worked as a freelance writer and photographer. I published 38 books at this point. But I traveled around all over the United States in researching these books, and I was always interested in what fire issues were in every ecosystem I visited. And so that led eventually to a book, put the first slide up on there, Wildfire, A Century of Failed Forest Policy. And this was a big coffee table book. And the purpose of the book was to put a more positive view of wildfire. It's not coming up, is it?
No, there you go. Oh, no.
That's not it?
Keep going.
Okay.
More.
There it is, there's the cover. And so that book has a lot of pictures of things like flowery meadows and places that were burnt at the time in the past, but trying to convey the beauty of the bird forest. Next slide. So I want to try to convince you of a different paradigm, that wildfire creates a beautiful landscape and is very important ecologically in what it does. And we have this whole paradigm. We always think that the fire, we use terms all the time in the media, the fire destroyed so many acres or devastated the landscape. But what you'll find is that wildfire is a very important ecological process, among others, that from an evolutionary perspective has shaped many ecosystems, particularly in the West. And a lot of my talk is about the West. Not everything I say will apply to the East, but a lot of the same principles will be there. I have to say next slide now. I done the job. So I like this one. This is from a Robinson Jefferson poem, but with the wolf's tooth whittled so fine, the fleet limbs of the antelope. The idea being that these are evolutionary processes that shape ecosystems. And the beautiful results afterwards, that's the second picture there. Next picture. So we have this whole dynamic because of our human bias of good fire versus bad fire. I hear it all the time, particularly in the West. I don't know what you say here. But the idea is that the predominant view is that some fire is okay so long as it doesn't kill too many trees or wildlife or whatever. But that's our perspective on things. And of course, if a fire burns your house down or your town, that's not a good thing. But from an ecological point of view, the fire is not necessarily bad. Now, next slide. I'm going to use a few terms, and I want people to understand the terms. There's a definition called fire severity. And you get everything from the top of that picture there, shows where all the trees are killed in that area. That would be a high severity fire. And then mixed severity is a percentage, 25 to 75% of the trees could be killed. And low severity means the majority of the fires survive. I mean, majority of trees survive. So I'll use those terms throughout, but just keep them in mind as I go forward. Next picture. So we are having an increase in fires. But what we're seeing is the result of climate, which is being changed by human carbon emissions. But still, climate is the driving force in wildfires. And it affects, along with other things, what plants you're talking about, the topography and some other variables, what kinds of fires you get, whether you have a large fire or not, a small fire and so forth. So next picture. So what we have across the globe right now is 20% of the burnable land area is now departed from its historic conditions. Now, understand that historic is defined as the most recent history of the last couple hundred years. And if you go back, I'll have a slide in a second here, we've had various conditions in the past that actually mimic what we're seeing today. So let's go to the next slide. And what we see, and I call what's called a shifting baseline. When you listen to the media and a lot of advocates of a lot of manipulation of forests, they say fires are worse today than they were in the 1970s. And worse in terms of, they're using that definition in sense of more widespread and more high severity fire that kills a lot of trees. But if you were to go back in time just a little bit in the 1900s, you'll find that at the early part of the century, there was a lot of large wildfires. One of the best known is the 1910 wildfire that burned 3 to 3.5 million acres of northern Idaho and western Montana. There's not been a single fire since then that large in the United States. And that was before there was fire suppression or any of the other factors. But it was drought conditions that year, along with a few other factors like high wind. Next picture. So where you start and how you count things makes a difference. So this one shows how much climate affects things. The red at the beginning there shows how many acres burned, and you can see that there's a part in the middle where the blue is, where there was not very many acres burned. But it was also a time when the western United States was cooler and moister than today. And showing how much the climate does influence wildfires. In 1929, a little thing was happening at that time called the Dust Bowl. We had almost 50 million acres burned across the West. Today, at 10 million acres burned, let me give you a reference point. Vermont is 6 million acres. So if 10 million acres, more than the size of Vermont, were to burn in a season, we call that a huge fire season. But 50 million acres, what's a comparable thing? Well, Maine is 20 million acres, so more than 2.5 times the size of Maine, burned in 1929. So just to see how this is affected by ocean currents offshore that often last decades that influence climate. Next picture. At that time, contrary to what's happening now, glaciers were growing in the West. When I started school at the University of Montana, including in that botany class with my fire ecologist botanist, we were talking about how the ice age was going to come down, glaciers were coming down from Canada, and how are we going to feed everybody when the cornfields in Iowa get covered with ice? And that was the worry in the early 1970s and 80s. And then what happened is by the late 1980s, so much carbon had been put into the atmosphere, it started to change the overall weather and climate. But we've had these variations, and this is what you hear from some people, that climate change is a hoax. It's not a hoax. But we have had variation in the past, and there's a correlation that can be shown between periods of warmer, drier conditions and large acreages of fire occurring on the landscape, and cooler and moister times, less fire on the landscape. Next picture. So for example, there was a little thing called the medieval warm spell between about 800 and 1500 AD. And during that time, that's when the Anasazi natives in the Four Corners area abandoned their cliff dwellings because it got too dry. They had to go to the Rio Grande where they had permanent water. It was also the same time when Greenland was colonized, and Greenland was warmer and greener then. And that was during one of these warm spells. And then the climate change, we had the Little Ice Age came along, and so forth. So we have this natural climate variation. Another important point is most fires remain small and go out without any suppression. We just take credit for it. And here's a study that was done in the West. Next slide, please. One more. Forget the comment, go ahead. Okay. There was, this was done in Yellowstone Park between 1972 and 1987. And 88 was the year of the big fires. There were 235 fires in the backcountry. 222 of them burned 5 acres or less with no suppression. They all went out. And even the larger ones, the few larger ones, more than 5 acres, all went out without any kind of suppression. And that's an important point because most fires, actually if you don't do anything, will go out on their own. Next slide. Another thing to look at is how much do they burn? Most fires don't amount to anything. This is another study that looked at 56,320 fires that burned 9 million acres in the Rocky Mountains between 1980 and 2003. And most of these fires burned an acre or less. 98% of the fires accounted for 4% of the area burned. So the vast majority of those fires didn't burn anything. And next slide. However, 2% of all the fires accounted for 96% of the acreage burned. So in other words, a very few amount of fires burn the majority of acreage. And of those 50 fires, 0.1% were responsible for half of the acreage charged. And this happens every summer. We get this distorted view of wildfire because we get these named wildfires that are very large and everybody gets the impression, you know, the whole world is burning down when most fires don't amount to anything and are fairly insignificant. And this is another important point. From an ecological point of view, the ecological and evolutionary work is largely done by the few large wildfires. In other words, you could have a fire, the Dixie Fire, I'll use that one, in 2021, it burned almost 1 million acres in California. And that fire, you know, does more work. You'd have to have, how many fires would you have to have of 1 or 2 acres to equal that one Dixie Fire in terms of the landscape affected? So keep that in mind. Even if we could put out all these fires, I would argue that we shouldn't, because there are ecological and evolutionary reasons for having wildfire in the landscape. All right, next slide. Let's see, what do we got here? Now, a lot of the fire management, at least in the West, is on the assumption that we want to prevent large wildfires. The problem is that when you have extreme fire weather, which I'll define in a little bit, it doesn't work. In other words, all those large fires I mentioned, that 0.1% of fires burn during what's called extreme fire weather conditions. And when you have those extreme fire weather conditions, you don't stop fires. And if you're a firefighter, you get out of the way until the weather changes, and then maybe you can do something about it. But so this picture is a bunch of clear cuts on a national forest out west, and you can see the fire burned all around it. If fuel reductions was going to do something to slow down fires, it would have stopped. So I'll go into this a little bit more detail in a bit. But one of the assertions is that fire suppression has led to higher fuel loadings and responsible for these large fires. And this is based on what's called fire scar studies. And there's a lot of problems with fire scar studies methodologically. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but I want you to just come away with the idea that, the next slide please, that fire scars studies have methodological problems that distort the story. And next slide. There are, next slide after this please. There are a whole bunch of other ways to determine fire history. Almost all of them come up with a different scenario or history of what's going on or what has happened than the fire scar studies. But fire scar studies dominate most fire research, particularly almost everybody got a PhD in the 1970s and 80s and 90s in fire ecology did it by doing fire scar studies. So that sort of dominates what's out there. But I'll just give you one example of one of the ones that are different because I participated in this. The Government Land Office reports, GLO reports. One of the ways to determine past fire history is to go over old surveys that were done back when the land was first being settled so they could determine property lines. So for example, in Oregon, the first government land surveys were done in the 1860s. That was before there was any settlement, before there was any logging, when there was still plenty of Native American burning going on and so forth. And what the surveyors did is they traveled across the land. They have a straight line they're shooting. And I was a surveyor in Alaska. This is my party chief here up on the Kobuk River in Alaska. But what you do is you record the vegetation that you're traveling across on this transect. So that, you know, if you come across a burnt forest, you mentioned we traveled a half a mile through the burnt forest, and now we're in old growth spruce forest or whatever. And so what some of the researchers do is they go back and they find these old surveys and they do the same transect. In other words, they run the same line that was run in 1860 or whatever, and they take a look at the forest and say, how does that match up with what was said in 1860? And so you don't have to guess what the vegetation is like. It's right there recorded. And they do the transect to verify that it was accurate, and that's the point. Anyway, I've done resurvey. I've done original surveys, but I did a resurvey of one of these lines across Montana once. It was really interesting. This was, you know, the survey was done like in 1880 or something like that. And it was amazing how accurate it was in the old surveys. We find all the corners that they had put out there within a foot usually, which was pretty amazing given the times and surveys. Anyway, there's lots of other ways to determine what was out there. Sediment studies, charcoal studies, pollen studies, etc. All right, so keep that in mind, other methods. And now, next slide. What you need for a big fire, this is extreme fire conditions, you need drought. Usually, low humidity, high temperatures, but wind is this really big secret in this cocktail. And when you have wind, it's very difficult to stop a fire, particularly high winds. And I use this point of, you know, you can have gasoline in your car, that's like fuel, right? But it won't go anywhere unless you have ignition, unless you know, shift the gears and do all this stuff. And that's the same thing with wildfire. So you can have a lot of fuel, next picture, and it won't necessarily develop into a large fire. A recent study found that 90% of acres occurred during periods of very strong winds. So wind is the common factor. Next picture. And as long as these coincide with heat, fuel, aridity, and extreme winds, you get these sparks coming and blowing in embers, and that blows beyond any kind of treatment you might have, whether you do forest thinning, whether you do prescribed burning or whatever, you're going to have a fire going. And you have to understand that fire spread is not linear, it's exponential. So that a 20-mile-an-hour fire is going to spread embers much faster and farther than one that's burning at a 10-mile-an-hour wind or whatever. And then you look at things like the fires that they're having in California, like they had this winter, 100-mile-an-hour Santa Ana winds. You think you're going to stop anything when it's blowing embers like that? Never. So the wind-driven fires blow the fires ahead and start other fires that we call it spotting, but you can see in this picture I took near Yellowstone during 1988 with the spotting ahead. And that's why things like thinning and prescribed burning will not work effectively under extreme fire conditions. And if fuels drove large wildfires, the largest wildfires we'd have would be in places like the Oregon Coast Range. But we don't have big fires there. Why? Because it is, next picture, another picture, please. We don't have big fires here because it's moist and cool. And so if it's moist and cool, you won't get large fires. So next picture. The main thing that's done today, and remember, this is trying to stop the large fires, is logging and prescribed burns. And logging called thinning. Next picture. So I want to show you something here. This was a fire that burned in 2020 in Oregon along the McKenzie River. And this shows you the fire severity. Green means it hardly burned at all. Red, it burned with high severity. Yellow is sort of mixed severity fire. And you see the arrow I have there pointing to the reservoir in the corner. Okay, next picture. This is a Google Earth. The arrow is pointing at the same reservoir. All right. Go back to the picture before, and notice in the eastern north corner, the eastern right-hand corner, it's real green. Go back to the Google Earth. There's no logging there. Then, where is all the logging? Go back to the picture again. that's where the high severity fires are occurring. And so why is this? Because logging often enhances fire spread. Because think of the conditions, again, that big fires burn. You open up the forest canopy, you have more sunlight, which dries out the vegetation and the soils, so you get a bigger vapor deficit. You have more wind penetration when there's, you know yourself, you get behind a real dense forest, trees, the wind can't hardly touch you. And then you go out where it's real thin, and it spreads the fire. Okay, next picture. Go past the Google Earth, go past the next one. Okay, so this is a good example of a situation. I happened to take this photograph of a thin stand on the left in May of 2021. This is the Dixie Fire in California. I came back that fall, and this is as close as I could figure was exactly the same spot that I took the previous picture. And you can see that the stumps there are blackened. That means the fire passed over that. In other words, if they had been logged after the fire, the tops of the stumps would have been white. So this is what was thin, and you can see that it didn't stop the fire at all. It was a heck of a fire burn through all these areas. Next picture. Another example, the Thomas Fire in California. The only fuel treatment that stopped it was the Pacific Ocean. It didn't cross that. Next picture. We have the Eagle Fire, which burned in the Columbia Gorge there in Oregon, and that fire jumped across the Columbia River, a mile-and-a-half wide river, no fuel. Again, wind blown. Next picture. So the majority of acreage burns on extreme conditions, and this is natural, not an aberration. Next picture. And there have been a lot of studies that you don't hear about too much, but that environmental conditions, when you have these extreme cases, they overwhelm most fuel treatments, and including prescribed burning and thinning. Next picture. And another conclusion, the same thing, fuel treatments cannot realistically be expected to eliminate large areas burned in severe fire weather. Next picture. And even the Congressional Research Service did a study and found that there's a weak relationship between acres logged and the extent and severity of fires. Fewer areas burned in areas where logging was limited. Next picture. Then there was a study, which is a review study. Review study means they look at a whole lot of studies and try to draw conclusions. They looked at 1,500 fires across the country in ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, and they found that forests with higher levels of protection, in other words, no logging, they were primarily looking at national parks and wilderness areas, had lower fire severity values than areas that were actively managed, even though they had a lot of vegetation there. Again, making my point that that doesn't necessarily drive large fires. So we have this whole Southwest model that dominates the thinking about fires, and that is that you have frequent fires, and that kept fires from getting big. And that may apply some of the time to the Southwest ponderosa pine forest, but it doesn't apply, next picture, to the majority of vegetation, at least in the West. So almost every other plant community in the West doesn't have frequent fires. They have longer rotations naturally between the fires, often hundreds of years. And so, it's not unexpected to have some fuel build up, so to speak, or accumulate if your natural fire frequency is 200 years. And this even includes things like sagebrush and chaparral and so forth. Okay, next pictures. And this is another important point. In most years, non-forested areas burn more acres than the forested areas. So this whole focus on forest, at least in the West, doesn't make sense because the places that are burning up in a lot of cases are in other kinds of plant communities like chaparral, grassland, sagebrush, etc. Next picture. Okay, so now we have people that say we have to fix the forest, either through logging and prescribed burning. Human manipulation, in my view, is not needed. Ponderosa pine, which is a common species in the West that they say we have to fix by logging and thinning, has existed as a separate species for 55 million years. And humans only arrived in North America 15,000 years ago. So either ponderosa pine forests were a heck of a mess for all those millions of years that they didn't have humans here to fix them, or maybe they can survive on their own without humans messing around with them. And when you consider that's true of almost all the different, next picture, plant communities, at least in the West. One more picture, yeah. I like this this cartoon, Gary Lysenkow. You can see the rings right here, Jimmy. That's another time when this old fellow's miraculously survived some big forest fire. But of course gets logged. That's what he didn't survive. And that's an interesting thing. I see all the time. There's among foresters and others, and I went to forestry school, by the way, so among foresters and so forth, they have this idea that the only mortality that's acceptable is chainsaw medicine to fix the forest. So if the forest trees are dying from insects, or drought, or wildfire, or whatever, that's not okay. We've got to fix the forest, and we go in there with chainsaws. And the irony is a recent study came out, found that if you combine the trees that are taken away through thinning with any mortality that might happen when you have a natural fire, you actually have more trees being killed. You know, but all those trees that are logged, nobody considers that killing the trees. Anyway, logging is not benign, so keep that in there. First, I'll show you. Go to the next picture, please. I'll sort of address these things that I have there. Okay, so this is at a certified conservation sustainable forest in Northern California. And to me, it's a biologically impoverished site. This is an ecological mess, a degraded forest. There's almost no dead wood on the ground, which in natural ecosystems you would have more of. There's almost no snags, which you would normally have. And so this is a sanitized forest. And it won't stop a fire either under extreme fire conditions. Next picture. So here's another one on the Deschutes National Forest. And again, the absence of downed trees and so forth. And it's like a monoculture. The trees that they left behind are almost all the same age, which you would not have under most natural conditions. Okay, next picture. And then something important is loss of genetic diversity. We have no idea. I go out with the foresters all the time. I say, okay, point to me the trees here in this stand that you're going to log that are resistant to drought. And they kind of look at me like, blank stare, like, what are you talking about? So, some of these trees have a genetic resistance to drought, I'm sure of it. Some of them can survive better in cool weather. Which ones are they? And what you find is in natural forests, there's this diversity of genetics that if you go in and thin, you often can eliminate those genetic traits, particularly rare genetic traits, maybe 1 in 100 trees might have, that'll be just the thing that'll help it survive the next event. Because we don't know where we're going with this climate change and what factors will be beneficial in the long run. Another thing with logging is it contributes more emissions than wildfire. This is for Oregon, and the largest single source of carbon emissions in Oregon comes from logging. Now, the timber industry is pretty big in Oregon, but it's more than transportation. It's more than anything else that you normally think about. So it's the green you see in this chart here, and logging accounts for 35% of carbon emissions. And so you're going in there and you're logging to prevent wildfires, next picture, and what you're doing is actually increasing the climate warming conditions through emissions. The other reason is fuel reductions, prescribed burning, or whatever, might work under low to moderate fire weather conditions. And so when you see studies that suggest that these are effective, they're not looking at the few extreme fire weather conditions and saying, is it wet, or they blend them in with all the other low and moderate things so that it masks the effect of extreme conditions. But it's insignificant. It's a watering can pond or a river. And another problem is that a lot of times, in that picture, you get these, the plants that come back. I took these pictures outside of Bend, Oregon, where I live, and the picture on the left there is all this grassland. This grass is what's called a flashy fuel. In other words, it burns real easily, and it burns real fast. That same site before the burn, prescribed burn, had been bitterbrush, which is a shrub. It's also flammable, but not nearly as flammable as the grasses that replaced it. Next picture. So what they're doing there now is we're doing prescribed burns, and so we have smoke all in the fall and in the spring, and then maybe in the summer if there's wildfires, but a lot of times there isn't wildfires. Like this summer, there were only 2 days in Bend that the smoke was considered unhealthy, and the rest of the time it was blue skies like this. And yet we had smoke in the spring and we had smoke in the fall with the prescribed burning. So I'm going to speed up one more thing. Skip this one, next one. How do you define what's a healthy forest? Well, one of the interesting things is that the second highest biodiversity in forest ecosystems, at least in the West, after old growth forest, is the snag forest that results after a fire, stand replacement fire. So ecologically, if you care about biodiversity, it's important. Next slide. For example, forest species are worried about green forests. A lot of species depend on the dead trees. So if you're a species that depends on dead trees, you're afraid of green forests. Next picture. For example, birds in the West. 45% of the bird species depend on dead trees and down wood. Next picture. Even bats, people don't think about this, but they roost under the bark on dead trees. Next picture. One more, go ahead. After a high severity fire, we get more bees, higher bee density and diversity for a number of reasons. Next picture. And even fish. After a big fire, you get bigger fish and more fish in the streams because the logs that result create habitat for the fish. I could give you a whole lot of other examples, but the point being is that it's not a disaster to have a high severity fire. And so finally, next picture, what we have is, so what are you going to do to prevent fires from burning down your house? Well, you have to reduce the flammability of the home, the immediate area. Next picture. So here's a picture I took in the Waldo Canyon fire in Colorado. Look at the green trees all around the foundations here, and pavement all around it. So the fire did not burn into the houses. What happened was embers landed on the houses and burned the houses down. Next picture. And here's Paradise, California, same thing. Fires burned down the foundation. You got green trees all around. I've seen this over and over again around the West. And in fact, the vulnerability of the house largely determines whether your house will survive or not. So we should be treating the fuels immediately around the houses and the houses themselves to determine, next picture, whether they will survive a fire. So one more after this. Treat things. So you get things like clean the gutters, metal roofs, screens on the vents, remove flammable materials like wood piles. A sprinkler on the roof will help. Next picture. These are cheap things. So there's a sprinkler on the roof. I bought 2 of these. Cost me $300 for my house. And last thing I'm going to do when I abandon my house is turn on the sprinkler. Maybe the house will be there when I get back. Anyway, next picture. So you start with the house and you work outwards rather than this idea that we have to sort of sanitize the forest all around. And it really does work. Fires will not ignite wooden walls at a greater distance than 130 feet away. So you don't have to do much beyond that distance to fireproof your house. And you have to think outside the box. I remember reading about one fire down in LA Basin where 50 houses burned down, and they looked at what was characteristic, and the neighbors didn't. That was, the next picture, doggy doors. And doggy doors are made to swing open, right? High severity fires happen when there's a lot of wind. So the embers got blown into the houses that had doggy doors, and the ones that didn't survived the fire. So, just that kind of thing. So, last slide. Ultimately, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and carbon. But meanwhile, keep in mind that climate weather drives large fires. Fuel reductions have limited value under extreme fire conditions. Another important point is the probability that a large fire will encounter a fuel reduction is very low, usually less than 1%. So you get all the negatives from doing the manipulation, and you don't get much benefit from that. It's an important point. Next picture. Wildfires and other natural events improve and invigorate ecosystems. Trying to change the paradigm here, how you think about them, right? And large fires provide the bulk of dead tree recruitment in forest ecosystems. And the way to protect communities is to reduce the flammability and prevent, zoning and prevent fire and the fire plain. And we have to we have to create habitat for forest elves. It's a very important reason for having large wildfires. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Hear me and see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, I'm seeing Kate Scott. Thank you, Kate.
Need more volume.
All right. So,
Yeah.
Volume, louder.
It's pretty much inaudible back here.
broad introductory overview of fires in North America, especially Western North America. I actually did my PhD thesis in Labrador, studying the natural role of fire in a boreal ecosystem. And one of the interesting aspects of Labrador is that the fire regime up there in the eastern part of the Canadian boreal completely different from that in the western part of North America. Whereas fires in Alaska happen every, say, 50 to 75 years, in Labrador the fire regime, fire rotation is more like 1,000 years, or even longer. And so this is indicative of the much moister conditions in the eastern part of North America. And the same thing is true, of course, throughout the Northeast, where there is abundant moisture and relatively little role for natural fire. But here what I'd like to do is to kind of broaden the discussion to what's happening in the Northeast in terms of active management in forests to convert them either to young forests or to shrublands and grasslands. And ask the question of why we are actually doing this. Why in the face of natural forest growth, why in the face of an interest in storing carbon in intact and maturing forests, we have on both public and private lands an extensive and well-financed effort to maintain a completely different type of vegetation. The conclusion I'm going to come to is that we're doing this for very good reasons. We're doing it because the vegetation that's created by these activities is unusual, and it supports an unusual array of plants and animals, insects, and other organisms. Also supports a very different array of environments. But I'll point out and try to make the point that this is a suite of conditions, these open land, shrubland, grassland, and young forest conditions, which are completely atypical of the regime that would have dominated the landscape before European settlement, and really are conditions that were created by intensive activities associated with European colonization. So here's two examples: fire and kind of clear cutting, leaving an open savanna of deforested and deep wooded landscape with a few a few additional trees. The fact that this is widespread, I can illustrate just with a couple of slides. Here's a brochure that came out of the Connecticut DEP, which is arguing for clear cutting of forests to create these kinds of open land conditions. And here's an example coming from Mass Fish and Wildlife, or Mass Wildlife, of grants that have been given to mostly private NGOs, a few towns, and private individuals over a 10-year period, more than $2 million of support for private land creation of open lands, shrublands, grasslands, early successional forests. This is, of course, in addition to any public funding and activity that's taking place on public lands. And the graph at the right indicates an ambition by Fish and Wildlife to put something like 20% or more of its holdings into that type of forest category or vegetation condition. Now I'd argue, and I don't have the time to go into all the data, but I will cite one study that's just come out, a very exhaustive study of 200,000 witness trees, which George referred to in his talk, looking all across the Northeast at the forest conditions at the time of European settlement. I will argue that most of the Northeast was in old forest, operating predominantly under natural processes with very minimal and very localized impact by a thriving native population that was able to live in coexistence with this forested condition. Now, the kinds of conditions that we're talking about are exemplified in particular sites. The very few sites that we have today, like the Pisgah Forest up in southwestern New Hampshire, which is shown on the left in the 1920s. It was impacted by the 1938 hurricane, which blew it down, almost the entire stand, leaving just scattered big trees. And on the right is a picture of what that stand looks like today. Now, Charlie Cogbill in his study provides a quote that's at the bottom of that central photo. Despite the common occurrence of catastrophic disturbances, the return time for fire and wind in the old growth landscape is much greater than the average age of trees in these landscapes. Therefore, small disturbances dominated the disturbance regime and determined the resultant age structure of the region. Largely, we should have an uneven aged or patchy, even-aged forest conditions with the vast majority of trees either in an old condition or undergoing succession towards that condition. As a result of that history and the subsequent European history, the single most uncommon forest condition and habitat type in New England is not early successional or open land vegetation. It is in fact old growth vegetation, forest that is developing into old growth, having been disturbed by natural processes, and the array of natural features like these downed logs and tip-up mounds that occur in forests that are allowed to operate under natural processes. So what happened between the time of Charlie's assessment and today, and how does this help us understand why we are managing for open land conditions? Well, this graph summarizes, doesn't capture fully, the dynamic of what's happened across New England in the last 400 years. Basically, with European arrival, there was a concentrated and incredibly effective and intensive effort to deforest the landscape, convert much of it into agriculture, and then to utilize the rest of the resource as thoroughly as possible. That led to this huge decline in forest cover across New England at the same time as the curve in the bottom left upper right shows, at the same time that the population was actually increasing. So starting in the mid-19th century and into the late 19th century and first half of the 20th century, there's been a remarkable reforestation, largely through natural processes rather than planting of trees, in which forests have come back across all of New England. Now, the important thing to realize with this graph is that in 1850, when Henry Thoreau was walking around Concord, Massachusetts, the few forests that did exist, and then across the rest of the region that were transformed by ongoing logging, were cut over and young. And so all of the right-hand side of this graph shows the recovery of forest cover, and to a certain extent a recovery of forest, intact forest, but all forests that remain young, remain something on the order of 50 to 125 years of age. So we are still, even though we have a lot of forest in the region, and that forest has the potential to grow older, it has a couple of centuries to go before it will really truly be in an old growth condition and undergoing the kinds of full range of natural dynamics that we would have seen before European settlement. So just to give a sense of what that looked like, here on the left, two pictures from Petersham, Massachusetts, one from the late 19th century, one from the modern landscape. You can see how cut over the landscape was, how extensively it was in what is largely a pastured and intensively grazed condition. And this was true of most of New England. Most agriculture was actually grazing. Only about 5% was the planting of crops. And then the remaining woodlots are heavily cut over, small, and many are confined to small patches and fence lines. The forest on the right looks intact. It clearly is a substantial forest cover, but most of that is the first generation of trees. The white pine, for example, all came in on old fields. The hardwoods there are sprouting and regrowing after intensive cutting and also seeding in onto old fields. So still a young and maturing forest that has the potential to store immense amounts of carbon and to become more mature and increasingly more diverse in forest structure. Now, at the same time that this deforestation and reforestation occurred, this tremendous change in habitat, along with focused efforts on extirpation and reintroduction of a few species, led to a complete transformation in the last 400 years and an ongoing transformation in wildlife habitat and wildlife species. And the major dynamic to notice here is, on the left, the decline of large carnivores and many woodland species, and there was a wholesale decline in woodland species as deforestation occurred and forests were heavily cut. And then a thriving of the landscape in the landscape that's described by Henry Thoreau in the mid-19th century of grassland species, shrubland species, early successional species of plants and animals. They're epitomized here by bobolink and meadowlark, but they include a wide range of plants and animals, birds and insects. If you read Thoreau's journals, you'll see what's going on. He's simultaneously lamenting the tremendous loss of wild nature and natural plants and animals. And he's, at the same time, is extolling the beauty and the vibrancy of the landscape that he lives in, which is thriving in butterflies, birds, insects, plants that are really uncommon in the forested landscape. So Thoreau has the ability to embrace both this new, very strongly cultural landscape shaped by European activities of raising animals, at the same time that he laments the loss of wild forest. So on the right, you can see that we're recovering many species. It's actually remarkable. The wildlife that have come back, both through natural processes of just reproduction and growth, migration of old species that were here and new species like coyote that weren't here, and some active reintroduction of species like bear and species like beaver and turkey and some others. So a variety of processes that are going on in this landscape, but there's a general tendency for a tremendous decline in open land species as our forests come back, and for forest species to increase and thrive. So how do we see these kinds of dynamics when we come down to Myles Standish State Forest? Well, interestingly, there was a really early for the kind of work that was being done, study conducted by Bill Patterson and Andy Backman in the 1980s, in which they were charged by DCR, DEM, to come in and examine the history of this landscape and the forest to provide a background for active management. And if you look at the pollen diagram here in the upper right, you'll see at the bottom, you'll see oak and white pine. You'll see that there's very, very little pitch pine. Pitch pine is overrepresented because it is wind pollinated. So hickory and beech, which are more insect pollinated or distribute their pollen very poorly, are actually constituents in the forest. At the same time, you see that there's essentially no ragweed, no rumex or sorrel, no grass. So no open lands, no early successional habitat, no weedy kinds of species. The conclusion from Patterson and Batman is that the area was covered by white pine and oak forest with beech and hickory when the Pilgrims arrived in the early 17th century. So amidst white pine and hardwood forest with the diversity of hardwood species. Following colonization, forests were logged and burned, and the land was cleared, leading to a decline in white pine and oak, and a great increase in pitch pine, grass, and weeds. And you can see the associated huge increase in charcoal that occurs after European settlement. And so what we have is the landscape being transformed by European colonization, land clearing, but in this area of Myles Standish especially, heavy logging and intense burning. And that produced a landscape which was atypical for history. It was a landscape dominated by pitch pine and by open areas, more shrubs, more grasses, and more fire. So if we come to that same landscape today, and here's the aerial photo of Charge Pond, where that diagram came from, you'll see that the state has managed the surrounding forest in a very unusual way. Most of the forest has been cleared. What you have are scattered largely pitch pine in a substantially open landscape with little understory and little structure other than the savanna-like structure created by isolated trees. And so in this particular case, the decision has been made to maintain, to manage in a way not to allow the forest to recover towards what it might have been during pre-settlement times, or not to allow natural processes to operate, which would tend to reduce the early successional species, reduce the grassland areas, reduce pitch pine over long periods of time, but to actively manage to maintain this anthropogenically created, European colonization created landscape of pitch pine scrub, so-called barrens. So the conclusion from Patterson and Batman's study is really quite telling. The present vegetation of Myles Standish State Forest is quite different from the white pine hardwood forest of pre-colonial times. Land clearing associated with settlement and extensive fires that have burned during the past 2 centuries have produced the pitch pine oak barrens that cover much of the landscape today. And our ongoing management is seeking to retain that vegetation into the future. Now, George was talking about fires, and of course, the other associated argument for clearing this landscape, cutting it very heavily, and burning it is because of the fear of forest fires. Now, we know that all the pollen diagrams, with a couple of exceptions from New England, show a huge increase in charcoal after European settlement. And we therefore know from the pollen work that's been done and from work like Charlie Cogdell's that fire was an unimportant part of the New England landscape before European settlement. But we also know that it became very important with European colonization. And so the question is, what's happened to them? since then? What's happened to fires across New England? And one only needs to look at the title of this very intensive kind of data collection effort by Lloyd Erlin, who was a forest economist based in Maine, who was hired by both insurance companies and I think and other groups that were interested in fire to assess the frequency and extent of fire in the historical period across New England, with a focus especially on the last century, the late 19th century into the 21st century. And his conclusion is fires virtually disappeared over a few decades in the mid-20th century, and that's illustrated by these curves here for Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. If we look at Massachusetts and look at the left, the top graph is acres burned, and the bottom graph on the left is the average size of fires. And these are the data collected by Lloyd from which he draws that conclusion. Interestingly, if we look at the number of fires, we see that that doesn't follow in an easily understood fashion at all. We went from having a large area burned in the early 1900s with average large sizes of fires to a very small area in relation and a very small average size of fires. But the number of fires has gone up in the mid to late 20th century and continues to be about as high as it was in the early 1900s. This is one of the reasons that when you hear discussions of fire, and it's important in New England, most of the discussion centers on the number of fires rather than the area burned. The area burned, the actual impact of fire to the landscape is quite small. And it should be noted, these are all set, with very few exceptions, are set by human activity, by carelessness and all. So the reason the fires have decreased is, one, people are more vigilant. There's a lot more people in the landscape with the means to report fires. The agencies involved in fire departments have been very effective at getting the fires and putting them out. People are much more cautious, and we put in a lot of measures to reduce the number of ignitions. And also, the landscape is growing up into older forests and more continuous forests. And forests don't burn anywhere near as well as open grasslands, open shrublands, and open savannas of vegetation. Now, just in case there was a question about the most recent data, I did include the data down here. You can see that the number has remained low to the present. So an average of, something below 1,500 acres a year that's burning in Massachusetts annually. So I wanted to make the point about fire spread by looking at these two contrasting photos. On the left is an area which has been clear-cut or cleared of trees and then burned and then mowed extensively to create a kind of open hardwood savanna with huckleberry and other ericaceous plants and lots of grasses, little bluestem and other species in there. And this has recently been mowed in the last year, so there's very little fuel out there, very little vegetation other than the trees. That landscape, as it grows up, will become bushy very quickly. It'll have a lot of what are called fine fuels that burn very readily. Because it's open, it gets a lot of sunlight. They will dry very easily, and winds will move through this landscape very quickly. As a result, this will very rapidly, the area on the left, become a real tinderbox for fire and capable of carrying fast, intense fires. So in order to keep it from being that way, we need to manage this and manage it regularly. Every, say, 3 to 5 or 10 years, this area, probably less than 10 years because of the scrub oak that's out there and the huckleberry, to keep the fuel down. So when you create grasslands, when you create shrublands, when you create savannas, you are buying into a management regime in perpetuity in order to keep it in that state and to keep it safe from fire. On the contrast, on the right is the forest here on Martha's Vineyard where I'm sitting, which is slated to be clear-cut and turned into a landscape like that on the left. Now that forest has a high canopy that reduces the moisture at the ground level, it reduces wind speed at the ground level. The fuels in here are discontinuous, so fire would spread, but it would spread slowly. And as this forest gets older and older, at this point it's 100 years or less in age, as it gets older and older, the understory and overstory will become even more separated, and the forest will be even less susceptible of carrying fires that move rapidly or are intensive. So let me conclude and then show 2 quick additional slides of information. So I think broadly across New England we can say that the landscape was largely covered before European settlement by old and naturally operating forests that were modestly and only locally affected by indigenous activity. There were no upland grasslands, few upland shrublands, and there were early successional forests that were created by the very occasional fire, but most likely by downbursts and other meteorological events like hurricanes and ice damage. Those forests were totally transformed and eliminated by European settlement, and we are now into a process of regrowing continuous forests and older forests that will continue if natural processes are allowed. So the land use practices that are used today to maintain these open land conditions are not trying to maintain something that is native or natural to the landscape. They're trying to maintain a cultural legacy of colonization. They're trying to maintain species which are very uncommon in the landscape, were much more common 50 or 100 years ago when we were still in the throes of deforestation in the early stages of regrowth of forests. But these are species that are decreasing as the naturally forested conditions expand. So those practices, of course, undermine natural succession, they undermine carbon sequestration and climate mitigation, and they undermine the establishment and thriving of woodland species. So we can argue about the need to maintain cultural landscapes, and I actually believe that there is a good argument for maintaining cultural landscapes. But I think that we should be able to focus on a need that is overridingly important, and that is to allow a large segment of our landscape to recover back into old forests. Old forests that are not going to be identical to those before European settlement, but that will mimic many of the natural processes, many of the forest structures, and will harbor many of the woodland species that were present 500 years ago. And then finally, and this is where I'd like to conclude, I do think it's important to maintain culturally induced species, especially if they are rare in other species, and I think a strong argument can be made for that. But I don't think you do that through the exorbitant expense and effort and negative environmental impacts of clear-cutting forests, burning them, mowing them, and using heavy equipment to keep them in a historical condition. I think instead what you do is you try to work with those landscapes where those types of habitats need to be created for other reasons, and these would be like power lines, landfills, Air Force bases, the sides of air runways where there are expansive grasslands, and also work with individuals who manage the land actively to keep it in a non-forested condition for a living, and those are farmers. So that takes me a few thousand miles east of us to Europe, where people have been maintaining, recognizing that their landscape is culturally induced, and have been maintaining it for hundreds of years, in some cases thousands of years. Here's a site in Ireland, which was heavily forested thousands of years ago, has been deforested over the subsequent few thousand years, is maintained by sheep, and is maintained in an open, diverse, culturally significant way, maintaining species, views, qualities, aesthetics, and characteristics that are adored by this population. At the same time, there is a huge move across Europe to rewild a lot of these landscapes and to allow them to go into native forests in the way that New England has already done it. And then finally, I just refer you to these two articles. The one at the bottom, more recently pulled together by Michael Kellett. The one at the top shows that for at least 25 years, 20 to 25 years, we've been focused very actively on these issues. This particular paper argues very strongly that there's an opportunity to move forward to maintain both European culturally induced landscapes and natural landscapes that are operating freely in New England. But we need to do it by adjusting the actors who are involved in the areas in which we are actively managed. Both of those can be found by going to the Harvard Forest website and searching on the authors involved, and they'll turn up a number of articles along these lines. Thanks very much.
Hello? Thank you, David. We wish you could be here. We know you couldn't. I'm going to do very quickly go over some, basically filling in some gaps, not gaps, but issues that those two fellows have talked in depth about, but had not talked about some other things in as much depth. So we're going to be very short here with our last two presentations, which was basically to sort of fill in some important things. So if we can go to my slideshow. Brief going through these. I'm not going to be reading lots of text or whatever, and this will be recorded, so if people want to go back and look at it, they can go back and look at my presentation. But anyway, what this is about is questioning what are the questions and concerns about the management that's going on Myles Standish State Forest, and some of the issues have been talked about already. So I'm going to just fill in some gaps. Next, please. So this is the kind of thing that's going on in terms of actually underground management that David was talking about. Next, please. And here's the result. And the main reasons are, as has been mentioned, that this is being done is to reduce wildfire risk and intensity and to restore pitch pine public barrens. Next, please. And so David mentioned this report that we did, this paper, and what we did is we looked at 500 references on these issues, related not just on Myles Standish. Okay. But also the whole issue of intensely
This always happens. Technology.
No, I think it's charged, the battery is. So anyway, look at, I'll have to talk. I can talk, that's fine.
Yeah.
So we looked at the whole issue that David was talking about. So the point is that as David pointed out, and George has too, there's a huge difference between an intact forest that's left alone and allowed to proceed as nature takes its course, and with intensively managed forests. And this is the, thank you. This is Myles Standish State Forest, and the left side is forest that's been allowed to grow for a number of decades. Now on the right is an area that was intensively cut and burned and was burned again, I guess, recently. Next, please. And this is a slide that David showed, and I'm only doing it again because it's really important that the goal here is to reproduce an abnormal period in terms of the long-term ecosystem that occurred in the late 1800s through middle 20th century. And what happened is a lot of species that were uncommon in New England, of course, when you cut it over and they love that habitat, they're going to move in from open habitats in other places. And that's what happened. And there are some species, in fact, that weren't even here probably before 1600, and they moved in from other places. But the thing is, these species, in our paper, we couldn't find any species that are being specifically targeted for this habitat management that are endangered throughout their range, that are in danger of becoming endangered, that are extremely rare throughout their range. These are species that, some of them are rare in Massachusetts, but that doesn't mean they're in trouble throughout their normal range. Next, please. Here's some examples. Woodcock, meadowlark, rough grouse, New England cottontail. These are species that there's no credible evidence that we could find that these species are in danger. Some of them really went down in numbers as the forest grew back, because that's the normal habitat. Next, please. New England cottontail is an interesting example because if you look at this map, it shows this, and this is pretty much guesswork because we really don't know. Nobody knows how many of these rabbits, the cottontails, there are. But basically, as the forest was cleared, there was more and more habitat. So they went from being relatively having small part of the habitat, part of the landscape, to going up and up and up to the north, even to Maine, where they weren't probably there before 1600. Trouble is, they compete with the eastern cottontail, which was introduced, and but they look the same. Nobody but a super expert can tell unless you actually examine them or look at their DNA or whatever. We're told that the species is endangered, but number one, we don't know how many there are because they're really hard to count, and number two, they look the same as another species that's common. They're hunted. You can go out and shoot cottontails in Massachusetts, and there's no bag limit. You might be shooting an endangered New England cottontail. Who knows? If they're really endangered, why are we hunting them? It's nuts. But they're creating 25-acre clear cuts. They're just clearing the forest 25 acres because supposedly this is great habitat for New England cottontails, but actually there are papers, newer papers, that are saying, we took a look at it actually on the ground, And it's not clear that this is even all that great for New England cottontails. In fact, it may be better for eastern cottontails. So it's probably just the rabbits were never all that common to begin with, and they're returning to normal populations levels, excuse me. But the point is, we're doing this radical changes in the ecosystem, and really we don't even know if it's helpful, hurtful, what's going on. Next, please. And David talked about old growth forests. Here's a graph from our paper. You can see on the left, before 1600, almost all the forest was old growth forest. 1977, there was virtually no old growth forest or close to old growth. Today, the forest is recovering, so there's a little bit of old forest or close to old growth, but we're way down from what the original forest was. So why we would prioritize creating artificial early successional forest and not old growth forest, really, it's very questionable. Next slide, please. So there are lots of problems too. That's the thing, is we're doing this management, and it has a lot of collateral damage. Invasive species, next. It disrupts the climate because when you change the forest cover, it's hotter, it's drier. Temperatures are a couple degrees hotter because of that. Also, water, the hydrology changes. Next slide, please. Carbon release. When you log, it releases most of the carbon pretty quickly in the forest. This slide, the bright green, is the forests that have the most carbon. And interestingly, most of Mass is green. This region is not. And that's because there's been a lot of disruption, and it hasn't recovered like it has in a lot of the places in Western Mass as much. If we left the forest alone, the amount of carbon storage would double, probably, because of the capability of storage. Next, please. The other problem with burning is it pollutes the air. It spews out a bunch of smoke. That's a public health threat. It pollutes the air and water. And as George pointed out, it produces more smoke than wildfires because the area is unlikely to probably burn anyway, so you're just creating a fire that was unnecessary. Next, please. There are a lot of health impacts. I won't go into detail, but it's been well documented that smoke from fires, it creates a whole bunch of health problems for people. Next, please. So the better alternative, I think, is to allow natural disturbances wherever we can, especially on public lands where we don't need to be doing disturbances and intensive management. And we need a lot more information because, as I pointed out with the New England cottontail, we really don't know that much about what's going on with that species. We don't know where it's all headed with climate change. We should protect big tracts of forest, and there are cases like, as George pointed out, there are some situations with fire where when you have people living near the forest, you want to do what you can to protect homes and so forth, but logging back way back away from those homes is not going to do you much good. Next, please. So anyway, E.O. Wilson, the legendary biologist, was supportive of this strategy of protecting forests as reserves, including Myles Standish State Forest, which is a reserve but isn't fully protected. Next, please. So I think we should let Myles Standish look more like this than it's looking in the areas that are managed and protected. Next, please. So, thank you. We're going to have a question and answer later, but I would be happy to, if folks want to email me or whatever, I'd be happy to answer questions, and so thank you.
pleased to be here, and I really want to thank you all for coming today. I'm going to take a little different approach to all of this and sort of set it in the, is this working? Okay. Sorry about that. I'm not a rock star. It's going to take a while to get up to speed here. Anyway, I was saying I'm going to take a little different approach, and my idea was to set it in the context of our planetary emergencies and how these local actions feed back to protect the entire planet. I'll try to cut this really short and drop out parts of it, but let's jump into it. Some of us are old enough to remember when humans first got high enough up into the sky to see the planet as a whole. This iconic photograph from a half a century ago makes it obvious that we live on a finite world that must supply all our needs. The entire human system must fit inside the Earth system, all the air we breathe, all the water we drink, all the food we eat, and all the energy and raw materials from which we build our dreams are inputs to the human system, and all the waste products from all these activities are its outputs. This is the real economy, the ecological economy, the economy that really matters. It is now abundantly clear that the details of these flows, and especially the enormity of their scale, press up against the limited ability of the Earth system to support the human system. One way or another, we must learn to live within the regenerative capacity of planet Earth, our one and only home. So welcome to the Anthropocene. Next. I won't have time to go into this. The planetary boundary framework has been developed by a large team of scientists and is very influential for people trying to think through how to get through our current planetary emergency. I encourage you all to check it out online. It's readily available, and particularly that you can check out the Planetary Health Check, which kind of summarizes the current state of this research. Next slide, please. I think we'll pass over the details of how to do this. I want to focus on one of the 9 boundaries, and just in passing note that 7 of the 9 are already in the danger zone. I wanted to focus on just one of the planetary boundaries. That's that tries to encapsulate the threat to the living world on planet Earth. Next slide. Next slide, I'll skip over that. They refer to this as the biosphere integrity. I won't go into detail except to say that the biodiversity crisis is real, already alarming, and rapidly growing worse. Extinction rates of vertebrates are already estimated to be 100 times worse than the background rate over the last 10,000 years. We can get some visceral appreciation of the magnitude of this crisis when we note that the global biomass of humans and their livestock together now comprises some 96% of the total biomass of all terrestrial vertebrates. That's only 4% for all the wild amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals combined, the ones that live on land. The biomass of our pet dogs alone is about equal to that of all wild mammals on land. Just think about that. Next. All right, let's come down from the stratosphere and talk about our local situation. It's instructive to consider a local tragedy, the extinction of the heath hen, and it happened right here in southeastern Massachusetts. Through overhunting and habitat destruction, the heath hen was almost entirely extirpated from most of its historical range, which was from Massachusetts to Virginia. By the early 19th century, it had virtually gone from its entire range. And by the end of the century, the only surviving population was on Martha's Vineyard. Early reports indicate that the heath hen utilized open shrubbery kind of country, pine barrens essentially. It's really the iconic vertebrate of the original pine barren. But numerous specific details about its natural history and habitat requirements can now never be known. Finally, a reserve was established to protect the heath hen in 1907 on Martha's Vineyard, but not before the population had collapsed to only about 100 birds. With this protection and a series of good years, there were 2,000 birds or so by 1915. Things were looking up, but tragedy was just around the corner. A catastrophic fire driven by gale-force winds erupted during the breeding season of 1916. The fire killed many birds and destroyed food and cover for the few survivors. The following winter, there was an eruption of northern goshawks from the north of us, and they killed off many of the last survivors. The population never recovered from this 1-2 punch. But it's ironic in what we've heard from today that the iconic vertebrate of the pine barrens was wiped out by a fire. The last surviving heath hen, a male known as Booming Ben, tried year after year to attract a mate, but to no avail. Booming Ben was last seen disappearing into the brush in March of 1932, less than a century ago. Attempts to introduce greater prairie chickens, which are as close as relative and perhaps the same species from out west, were entirely unsuccessful. And many of the museum specimens of heath hens available today turn out to be greater prairie chickens from out west. Whatever secrets allowed the heath hen to survive on the Atlantic coastal plain vanished with big Booming Ben and his kin. Next, please. This map shows the historical range of the greater prairie chicken, and the heath hen is currently considered a subspecies of that species. The current range is shown in green on this map, the historic range in blue, with you can see the coastal population. It seems clear that the extensive range in the prairies was at one time joined with the range on the east coast. And we know that there were tongues of prairie pushed far to the east in relatively recent times. Some iconic species like the buffalo occurred as far east as Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. This is a local bee. I collected on some of these in Myles Standish State Forest about 50 years ago. And the conservation story of Walsh's Anthoptera shown here on its favorite pollen source, the wild indigo, offers a haunting resemblance to the story of the heath hen, but hopefully with a much better ending. Next slide, please. Here's a male captured on Cape Cod showing its fancy white facial markings that don't occur in the female. Like the greater prairie chicken and the heath hen, Walsh's Anthopter exhibits a disjunct distribution, including large areas on the western prairies and along the east flank of the Rocky Mountains from Canada to Texas, with an isolated population here in Massachusetts. Perhaps at one time it had much wider eastern distribution like the heath hen, but we will never know. Unlike the prairie chicken, however, there are some annectant populations in Illinois, Iowa, maybe Michigan, that show that the range was more extensive in the past. Next slide, please. It's favorite pollinator, pollen source around here, the wild indigo, occurs only in the eastern United States. So whatever the western bees are doing, it's not going to what appears to be the main pollen source here. So just how different Walsh's Anthopter is from the western population remains to be illuminated. Next slide. Here's another picture of this handsome bee. The challenge now is to find a way for Walsh's Anthopter to persist and thrive here in Massachusetts. I submit that establishing and maintaining vast areas of eco-engineered pine barrens on land that once supported a mixed forest is far from optimal. Instead, we should first consider a far more targeted approach. An approach that identifies current populations and helps them to thrive, while offering expanded opportunities on open land already maintained for other purposes, such as power line easement, or there's already a population on Camp Edward, where the species already occurs. Another tactic would be to encourage people to provide suitable habitat around their houses or farms and they could plant wild indigo, which would be it's extremely easy to grow, thrives on neglect, and supports several other species of conservation concern. Next. Sorry. Okay, here are just a few of the 400,000 species of beetles known to science, and new species are being added all the time. Beetles are especially diverse, but even so, they represent but one modest branch on the overall tree of life, although we share the planet with about 10 million species, more or less. No one knows for sure, and only about 2 million have been formally described and named. That's 10 million evolutionary success stories. 10 million answers to the fundamental question of how to make a living on planet Earth. These 10 million species jointly interact to create a living world of astonishing complexity. These are the true essential workers of the world that built the world we grew up in. And we trash that world only at our greatest peril. Next. Any program of land management will benefit some species and harm others. Consequently, almost any program can be justified by focusing on the winners and ignoring the losers. Far too often, interventions in the name of conservation have been devoted to helping species that thrive on disturbance. Here in Massachusetts, we hear a great deal about protecting the whippoorwill and the prairie warbler, and almost nothing about other declining species that require interior forest habitat, such as the wood thrush and the cerulean warbler. Next, please. These four maps illustrate the dramatic decline in primary or old growth forests from the years 1620 to 1990. Like a swarm of locusts, the European colonists slashed their way through the vast American forests, leaving only tiny remnants almost everywhere, and especially in the eastern half of the country. As already noted today, the dramatic changes in land use during the later 19th century and to now allowed secondary forests to regrow here in the Northeast to produce some of the most carbon-dense forests north of Mexico. Given the extent of deforestation and the ongoing degradation from active land management, protecting existing forests so they can become the old growth forests of tomorrow must be a conservation priority for today. And I think that point has been made by every speaker today. Next slide. So what is to be done? There's a lot to be said about how to best deploy our limited conservation resources. But as widely understood by conservation biologists, the fastest and generally most effective way to protect biodiversity is to establish forever wild reserves where natural processes are allowed to proceed with only minimal human intervention. Less than 2% of Massachusetts is so protected, and much of that in the National Seashore and Cape Cod, land that may not even exist in another century or two as sea levels continue to rise from global heating. The fundamental importance of reserves is the basis of the international 30 by 30 movement to preserve 30% of the Earth's surface by 2030. As already noted, E.O. Wilson pushed for even more. Either way, we have a very long way to go, and the best and most effective place to start is our publicly owned lands, which should be held to a higher standard, firmly grounded in the common good. Here in Massachusetts, we the people own nearly 10% of the landscape, 10% that could be protected almost immediately with almost no draw on the public purse. Even when significant interventions must be considered, the scale of the intervention must be of only minimal size to reach our specific goals. These mass transformations of the landscape have no basis in real conservation. It's appalling to see so many massive interventions when we don't even know what lives here. This is eco-engineering on a landscape scale with only minimal understanding of the ecological players and the processes involved. Foresters often style themselves as physicians, writing prescriptions and applying treatments to improve forest health. But we must insist they go further and embrace the Hippocratic oath. Primum non nocere, first do no harm. Physician, heal thyself. Next slide. This is Frida Kahlo's last painting done just 8 days before her death. To me, at least, the exuberant color and sheer vitality always provide a source of inspiration for pressing forward in these trying times. Let us all embrace its message of hope and perseverance. Viva la vida. Long live life. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bill. Just a quick wrap up here was to give a different perspective on fire and other intensive management of the landscape, both pro and con, because we don't think there's enough of that side of the discussion happening, and people need to know, people need to make their own decisions, but there's a lot of information that you may not know about, and we try to share some of that with you. We're going to have a Q&A, we're going to do it now, or?
Yes.
Okay, one last thing before we do that is there are some things if you haven't done it, you can sign over here to support. There are 3 bills, and we've all mentioned the need to protect our forests, to have greater protection for mass forests, and there are things you can sign to support are 3 bills that would protect about 85% of public lands, not all of them, but about 85%, and we hope you'll sign them. If you want more information on that, you can go to savemassforest.com website, which has all the latest information on the bills and so forth. So, thanks.